In the crumbling archives of an old Louisiana parish courthouse, a discovery has been made that challenges the biological laws of human existence. It is a macabre mystery buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference, hidden within the mundane ledgers of the antebellum South, where human beings were catalogued alongside livestock and furniture. A researcher tasked with digitizing these forgotten inventories noticed a statistical impossibility that science can't explain. Across slave schedules spanning nearly 40 years, from the administration of James Monroe to the height of the Civil War, the same name appears with terrifying consistency. The entry is always the same, written in different hands by different clerks, yet describing a person whom time refused to touch. She's listed simply as Lydia Mulatto Girl, age 9, in 1823, and again as Lydia Mulatto Girl, age 9, in 1860. This is not a clerical error, nor is it a case of different children inheriting a family name to maintain a plantation's inventory. As the investigation moved from the dusty ledgers of St. Francisville to the ruins of the Valcour plantation house, a darker truth began to emerge from the silence of history. Physical evidence, daguerreotypes, medical field notes from Union surgeons and private diaries reveals a child who stood still while generations of masters withered and died around her. She appears in the background of family portraits separated by decades, always the same height, wearing the same expression of detached observation, bearing the same faint scar above her left eyebrow. The official records suggest a case so sinister that the local church refused to baptize the child, and the family doctor eventually refused to treat her, fearing that her unnatural vitality was being stolen from the very heir of the household. What follows is a reconstruction of the dark secret of the Valcour family, a story of a human possession that outlasted its owners and became a living curse. It is a narrative that forces us to confront the possibility that some sins are too heavy to be washed away by the passage of time, and that the history we think is dead is actually watching us from the margins. This is the story of the girl who never aged, a documented anomaly that terrified an entire community and left behind a trail of evidence that scholars have politely ignored for a century. Before we open the ledgers and step into the humid, suffocating atmosphere of 1830s Louisiana to uncover this mystery, make sure you are subscribed to Before the Story and have enabled all notifications. The archives are opening and the truth is waiting. If you appreciate deep historical investigations that unearth what others have chosen to forget, please like this video to help these stories reach the audience they deserve. And I want to know, from what city or country are you watching tonight? Let us know in the comments below as we begin our descent into the Valcour files. The investigation begins with the Valcour Parish Ledgers, a collection of leather-bound volumes recovered from the damp basement of the St. Francisville courthouse in 1998. These documents, smelling of rot and old tobacco, constitute the banal bureaucracy of a wealthy cotton dynasty that operated along the Mississippi River. For the casual historian, they are nothing more than lists of assets, tax assessments, and crop yields, the dry mathematical skeleton of the plantation economy. However, for those who look closer, the sheer volume of the records creates a comprehensive timeline of a specific, isolated world. The Valcour family was meticulous, almost obsessive in their record-keeping, noting every purchase, every birth, and every death with the cold precision of industrial accountants. It was in the Inventory of Movable Assets, dated January 14, 1823, that the name Lydia first appears. She is acquired as part of a settlement of debts from a dissolving estate in the Bayou region south of New Orleans. The entry is unremarkable, sandwiched between the purchase of 2 plough horses and a set of imported French dining chairs. The clerk notes her value at $400, a standard price for a child of her age and description, and lists her duties as future house servant. But there is no indication of her parentage, no surname and no medical notes, only the stark designation of her age, 9 years old. By 1833, the Valcour plantation had entered its golden age, expanding its acreage and doubling its workforce. The ledgers from this period reflect a booming enterprise, with pages of profits and acquisitions written in the flourishing, confident script of the family patriarch, Henri Valcour. In the decennial census of the estate's population, amidst the changing names of field hands and the aging of the domestic staff, the entry for Lydia returns. She is listed in the household staff section, her duties now upgraded to nursery maid. The anomaly, easily dismissed as a scribal oversight at first glance, sits plainly in the column for age, 9 years old. 10 years later, in 1843, the handwriting in the ledgers changes. Henri Valcour has passed away, and his son Armand has taken control of the estate. The records become more chaotic, reflecting a turbulent transition of power, yet the inventory checks remain periodic and strict. In the 1843 asset summary, intended for an insurance assessment against flood damage, the entire human chattel of the plantation is re-evaluated. Men who were 20 in the previous record are now listed as 30. Children born in the last decade are now listed as field-ready laborers. Yet, in the domestic servant list, the name Lydia appears again. The appraiser, a third-party agent from Baton Rouge, lists her age, 9 years old. The consistency of this data point defies the logic of archival error. It is rare for 3 different scribes, the father, the son, and an independent insurance agent, to make the exact same mistake regarding the exact same individual over a span of 20 years. Furthermore, the description of the girl remains hyper-specific. While other entries might approximate age or use general terms like adult or elderly, Lydia is always pinned to that single-digit number. It suggests that her physical appearance was so undeniably prepubescent that no observer could possibly categorize her as an adolescent or a woman. The world of the Valcour plantation, as reconstructed from these documents, begins to take on a claustrophobic quality. While the ledgers describe the purchase of new machinery, the rotation of crops, and the births of Valcour grandchildren, this one element remains static. The plantation is an ecosystem of growth and decay, of biological cycles that govern every living thing within its fences, except for one. Lydia exists on paper like a typo that refuses to be corrected, a fixed point in a turning world. Historians initially theorized that Lydia was perhaps a hereditary name given to successive children to simplify the household hierarchy, a cruel erasure of identity where one 9-year-old girl replaced another as they grew too old for the nursery. This practice, while not unheard of in the dehumanizing system of chattel slavery, usually leaves traces in the mortality schedules or sales receipts. Yet, there are no records of a Lydia being sold, dying, or repurposed to the fields. There is only one entry, continuous and unbroken, suggesting a singular entity that occupied the nursery for decades. The setting itself contributes to the mystery. Saint. Brenzisville is built on the bluffs of the river, a place known for its isolation and its fog. The Valcour estate was situated miles from the main road, accessible only by a long tunnel of live oaks that blocked the sun. The isolation allowed the family to construct their own reality, unchecked by the prying eyes of neighbors or the law. Within this secluded kingdom, the laws of nature appear to have been suspended or at least ignored by those who held the pen. The sheer banality of the handwriting is what makes the discovery so unsettling. There are no exclamation marks, no notes of surprise in these early ledgers. The existence of a child who does not grow is treated with the same bureaucratic indifference as a carriage that does not rust or a cistern that never runs dry. It is listed as an asset, a piece of property that retains its value perfectly, defying the depreciation that claims every other living thing on the ledger. This silence in the records, the lack of acknowledgement of the miracle or the curse, is the first indication that the Valcour family was hiding something that terrified them. The first crack in the facade of normalcy appears in the private correspondence of Madame Delphine Valcour, Henri's wife. Unlike the sterile plantation ledgers, her letters to her sister in Paris offer a glimpse into the emotional climate of the household. In a letter dated November 14, 1832, written in elegant but shaky French, Delphine recounts a terrifying incident involving the girl from the bayou. She writes of a quiet afternoon when the household was disrupted by a scream from the scullery maid. Lydia had fallen into the main cistern, a deep, brick-lined reservoir used to collect rainwater for the kitchen. According to Delphine's account, the child was submerged for a period of no less than 20 minutes before the gardener could be summoned with a ladder and a hook to retrieve the body. The letter describes the scene with clinical horror. The child was pulled from the water, blue as slate, with no breath in her lungs and eyes fixed open, staring at nothing. The plantation doctor, a man named Dr. Morceau, was present for a dinner engagement and immediately examined the body. He declared the child dead, citing the lack of a pulse and the profound coldness of her skin. The body was laid out on the pine table in the summer kitchen to be prepared for burial. However, the horror that Delphine conveys to her sister is not the tragedy of a child's death, but what happened 10 minutes later. While the household staff was gathering linens, the dead child simply sat up. There was no gasping for air, no violent expulsion of water from the lungs, no disorientation. Delphine writes, "She did not wake as one saved from the river. She woke as one who had been interrupted in a task." The girl reportedly looked at the stunned doctor, slid off the table, and returned to her station to finish shelling a basket of peas, her clothes still dripping onto the floor tiles. Dr. Morceau's reaction, recorded in Delphine's letter, was one of profound disturbance. He did not celebrate the resurrection as a miracle. Instead, he recoiled. He refused to touch the child again, telling Henri Valcour that what he had felt under his fingers when he checked for a pulse was not merely the absence of a heartbeat, but the absence of the biological potential for life. He described her flesh as dense clay, something that mimicked the form of a child but lacked the vital spark that defines human existence. This incident marks the beginning of a shift in how Lydia is perceived in the documents. Before 1832, she is an item in an inventory. After the cistern incident, she becomes a subject of whispered fear. Delphine's letters begin to mention her discomfort with the child's presence in the nursery. She notes that the family dogs, usually aggressive with strangers and affectionate with the staff, would whimper and hide when Lydia entered the room. They sensed something that the humans were trying to ignore, a violation of the natural order standing quietly in the corner of the room. The letter also contains a chilling detail about the girl's eyes. Delphine mentions that after the drowning, the girl's gaze became heavy. She writes, "It is not the look of a child who sees the world with wonder or fear. It is the look of a statue that has seen the house built and will see it fall." This observation aligns with the later photographic evidence, suggesting that the entity inside the 9-year-old form was observing the family with a detached, ancient intelligence. Despite the mother's growing terror, Henri Valcour refused to remove the girl from the house. In a fragment of a diary entry from the same week, Henri dismisses the doctor's concerns as superstition and hysteria. He frames the survival as a stroke of luck, a preservation of capital. This reaction highlights the blinding nature of the slaveholder's mindset. To Henri, Lydia was property, and property does not have a soul to lose or a nature to violate. As long as she could work, her impossibility was irrelevant. The cistern incident created a divide between the masters and the enslaved population of the estate. Delphine notes that the other servants began to make signs of protection when Lydia passed. They stopped eating food that she had touched. A distinct separation formed. Lydia was no longer part of the community of the enslaved. She was something else, an entity that belonged solely to the white family, bound to them by a dark necessity that no one spoke of aloud. The final paragraph of Delphine's 1832 letter contains a sentence that foreshadows the decades of horror to come. She pleads with her sister to send holy water from a specific cathedral in France, stating, "The priest here will not bless the house while she is in it. He says that God does not watch this plantation anymore, and I fear he is right. The water in the cistern has not cleared since she fell in. It remains black, and the horses refuse to drink it." As the 1830s bled into the 1840s, the Valcourt plantation entered a period that historians would later identify as a golden rot. On the surface, the estate was more prosperous than ever, its cotton yields breaking parish records. Yet the archives reveal a pattern of domestic catastrophe that unfolded quietly behind the velvet curtains of the main house. The ledgers from this decade show a disturbing trend in household expenses. Every year, without fail, there is an entry for 3 dresses, child-size, muslin and calico. This annual purchase continues for 20 years, defying the logic that a child would eventually outgrow their clothes. Lydia remained a constant size, requiring a constant wardrobe of the exact same dimensions. More disturbing than the clothing receipts are the records of infant mortality among the Valcourt heirs. Delphine and Henri had 4 grandchildren born in the house between 1835 and 1842. Not one of them survived to see their 3rd birthday. The causes of death listed in the parish registry are vague: wasting sickness, failure to thrive, nocturnal fever. However, the nursery logs kept by the head housekeeper tell a different story. They describe the infants fading away, growing paler and weaker by the day, despite having hearty appetites and no obvious signs of infection. In these logs, the presence of Lydia is a recurring motif. The housekeeper notes repeatedly that Lydia was found standing by the cribs in the middle of the night, not touching the infants, simply watching them. There is no evidence of physical harm, no marks on the babies' bodies. Instead, it appears as though their vitality was simply evaporating in her presence. One chilling entry from 1839 reads, "The baby is grey this morning. Lydia was in the room all night. She looks rosier today, her skin is warm and the baby is cold." The entropy extended to the physical house itself. Silver polished in the morning would be tarnished black by sunset. Fresh flowers brought into the parlour would wilt within an hour if Lydia was present in the room. The very structure of the Valcourt home seemed to be aging at an accelerated rate, reacting to the unnatural stasis of the servant girl. Carpenters were summoned monthly to repair rotting floorboards in the nursery, while the rest of the house remained sound. It was as if the time that Lydia was not experiencing was being displaced onto her surroundings. Diaries of visitors from this period mention a heavy atmosphere at Valcourt. A cousin from Charleston wrote in 1841 that the air in the house felt used, as if it had been breathed too many times. She described the unsettling experience of seeing a servant girl who moved with total silence, appearing in rooms without the sound of footsteps. When the cousin asked the girl's age, Lydia reportedly did not answer, but merely smiled a smile that the cousin described as a mimicry of joy with nothing behind it. The enslaved community's reaction to Lydia is documented in the few surviving oral histories recorded decades later. They referred to her not by name, but as the stagnant one. They believed she was a haint or a spirit trap that the master had brought from the swamp to absorb the bad luck of the crop. But the trap was full, and now it was overflowing into the house. The field hands refused to look her in the eye, believing that to catch her gaze was to lose a year of one's own life. By 1845, the contrast between the plantation's wealth and its domestic misery was absolute. Henri Valcourt died of a sudden stroke, screaming about eyes in the walls. His son, Armand, inherited the estate. Armand had grown up with Lydia. He was a child when she was brought to the house. Now he was a man of 30, greying and stressed, while she remained exactly as she had been when they played in the yard. This visual discrepancy, the master aging while the slave remained eternal, began to warp Armand's mind. The household accounts show a sudden cessation of visits from the local doctor. Dr. Morceau's successor, a young man named Dr. Toussaint, visited the plantation once in 1846 and never returned. His private journal found years later states simply, "I cannot treat a patient who defies the laws of God. The girl has no heartbeat, yet she speaks. The master knows what she is, and he keeps her like a pet viper. I will not step foot on that cursed ground again." The accumulation of this evidence, the clothes that never changed size, the babies that faded while the girl bloomed, the silver that turned black, paints a picture of a parasitic relationship. Lydia was not merely surviving, she was thriving on the decay of the family. The anomaly was no longer a passive glitch in the records. It was an active, consuming force that was slowly eating the Valcourt legacy from the inside out, leaving behind only money and silence. In 1848, the perspective of the document shifts to the internal thoughts of Armand Valcourt. No longer the passive heir, he is now the master of a crumbling dynasty, and his personal journals reveal a man obsessed with the impossibility living under his roof. Unlike his mother, who feared Lydia, Armand developed a twisted scientific curiosity mixed with desperate narcissism. He did not view her as a curse, but as a biological resource, a localized fountain of youth that his father had purchased for $400. Armand's journal entries from that winter detail a series of experiments he conducted in the privacy of the master suite. He writes of his theory that Lydia functioned as a closed vessel of vitality, one that retained life force indefinitely. He reasoned that if he could understand the mechanism of her stasis, he could harness it for himself. "She is a dam holding back the river of time," he wrote on February 3, 1848. "I must only learn how to open the sluice and let it flow into me." The cruelty of these experiments is masked by Armand's detached clinical language, but the implications are horrifying. He describes forcing Lydia to sleep at the foot of his bed, believing that mere proximity would transfer her resilience to him by osmosis. He records taking clippings of her hair and fingernails, noting with frustration that they did not decompose or dry out like normal organic matter. He even attempted blood transfusions, using crude instruments to mix her blood with his own. The results of these transfusions were catastrophic, though not in the way Armand expected. Instead of gaining youth, his body began to reject the intrusion of the unnatural. His journals describe violent fevers, hallucinations of drowning in dry water, and a rapid acceleration of his own aging process. Within 6 months of beginning his experiments, Armand's hair had turned completely white. His skin became papery and translucent. At 33, he looked like a man of 60. Rather than deterring him, this failure convinced Armand of his hypothesis. He wrote, "She does not give life, she hoards it. She is a vacuum, not a fountain. She took the blood I gave her and kept it and took mine with it." His hypothesis shifted from a medical miracle to a metaphysical parasitism. He realized that Lydia was a singularity, a point where life entered and never left. The reason she never aged was that she was absorbing the time of everything around her. This realization drove Armand into a state of paranoid mania. He became convinced that the only way to survive was to offer her other sources of life to consume, to spare himself. The plantation records show a sudden increase in the purchase of livestock that was never slaughtered for meat. Pigs, chickens, and calves were brought to the main house and seemingly vanished. Armand's diary alludes to feedings in the nursery, vague references to leaving small animals in the room with the girl and finding them dead, but physically unmarked, the next morning. The psychological toll on Armand is evident in his handwriting, which becomes jagged and erratic. He begins to refer to Lydia not as the girl, but as the witness. He believed she was recording the sins of the plantation in her ageless body, that her immortality was a form of accumulation. Every lash of the whip, every stolen coin, every lie is stored in her, he scrawled. She is the ledger that cannot be burned. Armand's hypothesis represents the ultimate hubris of the slaveholder. Even faced with a supernatural entity that defied God and nature, his first instinct was to exploit it, to extract value from it. He could not conceive of a being that he could not own or use. His attempt to commodify immortality resulted in his own rapid destruction, physically aging him until he became a withered caricature of a patriarch, wheeled around the estate by servants who were terrified to look at him. By 1850, Armand had ceased his experiments, defeated by the girl's passive resistance. He locked her in the nursery, boarding up the windows, leaving only a slot for food. But the journals reveal that the lock was not to keep her in, it was to keep himself out. He had realized that she was not his prisoner, he was hers. She was the anchor that kept the plantation trapped in a cycle of decay, and he was too cowardly to cut the rope. By the early 1850s, the horror of Valcourt could no longer be contained within the property lines. The isolation Armand had imposed was breached by rumor and the growing suspicion of the St. Francisville community. The girl who doesn't grow became a local legend, a ghost story told in the taverns and churchyards. But for the planter class, it was a social scandal. The prevailing rumor was not that Lydia was immortal, but that Armand was a deviant who kept a series of young girls, all looking alike, to satisfy some perverse fixation. The social fracture is documented in a series of letters from the parish council and the local Catholic diocese. In 1852, Father Jean-Paul, the priest who had served the parish for 30 years, sent a formal letter of admonishment to Armand. The priest had attempted to visit the plantation for a routine census of the parish souls and had been turned away at the gate by armed overseers. However, he had seen enough from the road, a glimpse of the girl in the upper window, to be deeply disturbed. "There is a darkness sitting on your roof, Monsieur Valcourt," Father Jean-Paul wrote. "The rumors of your household are a stain on this parish. You are accused of harboring an unbaptized abomination. The people say she has been 9 years old for 30 years. If this is a trick, it is a cruel one. If it is true, it is the work of the devil, and you are his innkeeper." The letter concludes with a threat of excommunication if Armand did not present the child for examination and baptism or remove her from the parish entirely. Armand's response, preserved in the church archives, is a frantic, blasphemous scrawl. He denies the church's authority, claiming that what lives in his house predates the church. "She is not of your flock," he wrote. "She belongs to the soil and the silence. Do not come here, Father. Your holy water will turn to vinegar in her presence." This exchange effectively severed the Valcourt plantation from the protection of the church and the community. The isolation deepened. Neighbors stopped inviting the Valcourts to balls and harvest suppers. Merchants began to leave deliveries at the main gate, refusing to drive their wagons up the oak-lined avenue. They claimed the air grew colder the closer one got to the house, and that the silence of the birds and insects was unnatural. The plantation became a pariah state, a festering wound in the landscape that the rest of society tried to ignore. This fracture extended to the legal authorities. In 1854, the parish sheriff visited the estate to investigate rumors of irregularities in the treatment of the enslaved population. His report is brief and shaken. He notes that while the field operations appeared brutal but standard for the time, the main house was a tomb. He describes seeing Armand Valcourt, now completely bald and toothless at age 39, sitting on the porch, staring at nothing. When the sheriff asked about the girl, Armand simply pointed to the nursery window and laughed, a dry, rattling sound that the sheriff described as the sound of leaves blowing over a grave. The breakdown of social bonds meant that there was no one left to intervene. The cruelty and the madness inside the house went unchecked. The overseers, sensing the master's insanity and the community's rejection, ruled the fields with unchecked violence, while the house servants lived in a state of silent terror, trapped between a mad master and an ageless monster. The social contract of the plantation aristocracy, the veneer of gentility covering the brutality, had completely collapsed at Valcourt. The letters from this period reveal a community washing its hands of the Valcourt sin. They viewed the plantation's decay not as a tragedy, but as a judgment. In their eyes, whatever was happening to Armand was a private hell of his own making. They did not know that the entity in the nursery was not just Armand's problem. She was a symptom of a sickness that infected the entire system, a mirror held up to a society that refused to see its own reflection. The silence of the 1850s is the silence of complicity. Everyone knew something impossible was happening at Valcourt, but no one was willing to confront it. They preferred to let the mystery rot behind the locked gates, hoping that eventually the girl and the master would simply disappear. But Lydia did not disappear. She waited, watching the road, watching the neighbors turn their backs, recording their cowardice just as she had recorded Armand's greed. The most chilling piece of evidence in the Lydia file was discovered not in a ledger or a letter, but in a velvet-lined box found in an estate sale in New Orleans in 2004. It contained 3 daguerreotypes, early photographs on silver-plated copper, attributed to the Valcourt family. These images provide the visual proof that transforms the story from folklore into documented impossibility. They are the irrefutable anchor of the mystery, capturing the theft of time in high contrast. The first image, dated circa 1845, shows a relatively young Armand Valcourt standing stiffly on the porch steps. He is dressed in a dark frock coat, one hand resting on a column. Standing a few feet behind him, partially in the shadow of the doorway, is a dark-skinned girl. She wears a simple striped pinafore dress. Her face is clear, her expression neutral. She looks to be about 9 years old. The second image is dated 10 years later, circa 1855. Armand sits in a wicker chair, his face gaunt, his hairline receding, his eyes sunken with the stress of his experiments. Standing in the exact same spot, in the exact same position relative to the chair, is the girl. She has not grown an inch. Her face has not lost its childhood roundness. She wears a dress of the same pattern, identical in fit to the one from a decade earlier. The contrast between the rapidly aging man and the static child is jarring. The third image, dated 1861, is the most disturbing. It shows Armand Valcourt near death, a withered husk of a man in a wheelchair, wrapped in blankets despite the Louisiana heat. His hands are claw-like, gripping the armrests, and there, standing beside his wheelchair, her hand resting lightly on the back of it, is Lydia. She is still 9 years old. The lighting is sharper in this final image, revealing a detail that the earlier photos missed: a small, jagged scar above her left eyebrow. It is fresh, pink and unhealed, the same scar mentioned in records from 20 years prior. She does not heal and she does not scar over. She is frozen in the moment of some forgotten trauma. Forensic analysis of these daguerreotypes confirms they are not forgeries. The chemical composition of the plates matches the eras they claim to represent. The aging of the paper mounts is consistent. Digital facial recognition software confirms that the girl in all three photos is the same individual, with zero deviation in bone structure, eye distance, or jawline. In a biological human, 10 years between ages 9 and 19 brings massive craniofacial changes. In Lydia, there were none. The impact of these photos on the few who saw them at the time is recorded in the photographer's ledger. The itinerant photographer, a man named Silas Reed, noted in his logbook, Subject A, master, deteriorated significantly. Subject B, girl, presents lighting difficulties. Plate refuses to hold her eyes. They appear black in development, though brown in life. She does not blink. I felt a great coldness while under the hood. I charged double and left immediately. These images serve as a testament to the glitch in reality. They capture a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy affects everything in the frame except her. The peeling paint on the columns, the fraying of Armand's clothes, the overgrown weeds in the garden, all signify the passage of time. Lydia stands in the center of this decay as a fixed point, an absolute constant. The photos also reveal something about the power dynamic. In the first photo, she is in the background, a servant. In the last photo, she is standing over the invalid master, her hand on his chair. It looks less like she is attending to him and more like she is claiming him. Her expression is not one of servitude, but of ownership. She has outlasted his strength, his sanity, and his youth. For the modern researcher, these photos are the smoking gun. They prove that the written records were not exaggerations. A human child existed in St. Francisville who defied the fundamental process of life. The terror they evoke is primal. It is the terror of the uncanny valley, of seeing something that looks human, but lacks the essential quality of humanity, change. The American Civil War brought the collapse of the Southern Order, and with it, the final breach of the Valcour plantation's isolation. In 1862, Union troops moving up from New Orleans occupied the parish. A regiment of the 4th Massachusetts Infantry requisitioned the Valcour House as a temporary command post. The clash between the rational bureaucratic machinery of the Union Army and the supernatural stagnation of the plantation is documented in the field notes of Major Elias Thorne, the regiment's surgeon. Thorne was a man of science, a Harvard-educated abolitionist who viewed the South's backwardness with disdain. When he arrived at Valcour, he found the house in a state of Gothic squalor. Armand Valcour was barricaded in his room, raving. The slaves had largely fled, vanishing into the chaos of the war, but Lydia remained. The soldiers found her sitting in the nursery, calm and immovable. Thorne, tasked with assessing the health of the remaining inhabitants, attempted to examine the child. His field notes, preserved in the National Archives, begin with clinical detachment and descend into confusion. He describes attempting to vaccinate the girl against smallpox. The needle, he writes, met resistance not of bone but of surface tension. It was like trying to puncture a stone with a straw. When he finally managed to prick the skin, the wound did not bleed. It simply closed, the skin knitting together instantaneously as soon as the needle was withdrawn. Thorne proceeded to check for vital signs. He writes, "Subject appears to exist in a state of biological suspension. She is warm to the touch, unnaturally so, a steady 101 degrees, but I can find no pulse at the wrist or neck. Auscultation of the chest reveals silence, no heartbeat, no respiratory murmur. Yet she speaks when spoken to and tracks movement with her eyes. It is as if she is a painted image projected onto the air, possessing mass, but no internal mechanism." The psychological impact on the Union soldiers was immediate. Men who had faced cannon fire without flinching refused to stand guard near the nursery. They reported that their lanterns would flicker and die when she looked at them. They heard the sound of a nursery rhyme being hummed from the room when it was empty. The soldiers began to call her the ghost girl and the rebel witch. Discipline crumbled, desertions spiked. The men felt that the plantation was cursed ground, a place where the rules of life and death did not apply. Thorne's final entry on the matter is a confession of scientific failure. "I have seen men torn apart by grape shot, and I have slept in fields of the dead," he wrote. "But this child terrifies me more than any battlefield. She is an affront to the Creator. She is a biological impossibility that suggests we do not understand the nature of life at all. I have advised the Colonel to abandon this position. There is no strategic value here, only a deep and ancient sickness." The Union Army evacuated the Valcour house 3 days later, leaving the invalid Armand and the ageless girl alone in the ruin. The authority of the United States government, backed by rifles and science, had retreated in the face of the inexplicable. The collapse was total. There was no master, no law, no army, only the house, the silence, and the girl who waited. This withdrawal marked the end of any official oversight of the plantation. Valcour became a black hole on the map, a place where the war did not reach, because even the war was afraid to enter. The records from this brief occupation serve as an independent verification of the supernatural claims. These were not superstitious locals or guilty slaveholders. These were outsiders, rational men who looked at Lydia and saw a monster. The collapse of authority left the stage set for the final act. With no one left to witness, the dynamic between Armand and Lydia reached its terminal velocity. The documents suggest that Armand, realizing that even the army could not save him, decided to take the only action left to a man who has lost his soul: total destruction. The narrative of Lydia's origin remained a vacuum until the 1998 restoration of the St. Francisville courthouse, when a worker discovered a leather pouch tucked inside the hollow spine of a confiscated family Bible. Inside was a single folded sheet of parchment written in the hand of Armand's grandmother, the matriarch who had originally managed the estate's finances in the 1820s. This document, a deathbed confession dated 1825, reveals the terrible transaction that brought Lydia to Valcour. The letter is addressed to God, a plea for forgiveness that was never sent to a priest. In it, the grandmother admits that Lydia was not purchased at a market. She was acquired from a root doctor in the deep Atchafalaya swamp, a man rumored to practice the old arts brought from West Africa. The Valcour fortune had been built on brutal cruelty, and the grandmother feared that the spiritual weight of this cruelty, the sins of the crop, would curse the land and destroy their wealth. She sought a vessel. The root doctor offered her the child, describing her not as a human being, but as a sin-eater bound in flesh. The ritual, as described in the confession, was meant to transfer the metaphysical debt of the plantation into the child. Lydia was to absorb the suffering, the guilt, and the bad luck, keeping the Valcour bloodline pure and prosperous. "She is the cellar for our rot," the grandmother wrote. "As long as she keeps it, we remain clean." However, the confession reveals a fatal misunderstanding of the ritual. The grandmother believed the child would eventually die, taking the sins with her to the grave. But the amount of sin generated by the plantation, the daily violence, the exploitation, the greed, was so vast that it saturated the vessel. Lydia stopped aging because she became stuffed with the suspended time and stolen life of the plantation. She could not die because the debt she held was too great to be processed by death. The hidden source reframes the entire mystery. Lydia was not a monster who invaded the house. She was a tool created by the masters. She was the literal embodiment of their guilt, a mirror that they had constructed and then became terrified to look into. Her immortality was not a gift of nature, but a symptom of their endless crimes. She was trapped in the form of a 9-year-old because that was the moment the vessel was sealed. This revelation adds a layer of tragic irony to Armand's suffering. He was destroyed by the very mechanism his ancestors bought to save him. The entity he tried to exploit for youth was actually a concentration of his family's moral filth. The reason she hoarded life was that she had been designed to hoard everything, pain, time, sin, without releasing a drop. The confession also explains the heavy eyes and the silence. Lydia was carrying the psychic weight of thousands of lashes, screams, and deaths. She was a living archive of trauma. The document ends with a chilling warning. Do not let her leave the land. If the vessel breaks, the flood will drown us all. This warning explains why the family refused to sell her, even when they were terrified of her. They were holding a grenade with the pin pulled, afraid to let go. With this document, the story shifts from a ghost story to a moral parable. The horror is not supernatural. It is the horror of slavery made manifest. The Valcour tried to outsource the consequences of their actions to a child, and the universe responded by making that child an eternal witness who would never let them forget. The final days of the Valcour plantation are reconstructed from the disjointed, frantic scribblings of Armand Valcour in the margins of the 1863 almanac. Alone, abandoned by his staff and besieged by his own madness, Armand reached a conclusion that he justified with the twisted logic of the damned. He believed that the Emancipation Proclamation, signed that January, had broken the legal bonds of the world, and thus the spiritual bonds must be broken by fire. He decided he had to destroy the vessel to free his soul. Armand's plan was methodical and brutal. He recounts dragging heavy furniture, oak wardrobes, chests of drawers, down the hallway to the nursery. He describes the sound of the heavy wood scraping against the floorboards, echoing in the empty house. His goal was to barricade the door from the outside, turning the nursery into a sealed kiln. He believed that while bullets and needles could not hurt her, the purifying element of fire would finally consume the sin she held. The most disturbing aspect of this account is Lydia's reaction. Armand notes that as he hammered planks over the doorframe, sealing her in, she made no sound of protest. There was no screaming, no pounding on the door. Instead, he heard humming. She was humming a French nursery rhyme, Frère Jacques, a song about waking up to ring the morning bells. The sound of her calm, childish voice drifting through the cracks of the barricade drove Armand into a frenzy. She knows, he scrawled on the almanac's back cover. She knows that fire cannot burn what is already ash. But I must try. I must burn the ledger. I must cancel the debt. His justification was not just survival. It was an attempt to erase history. If he could burn the house and the girl, he believed the record of his family's evil would disappear. It was the ultimate act of the oppressor to destroy the evidence of the crime. Armand prepared the house for incineration with the same obsessive detail he had once applied to his ledgers. He doused the curtains in kerosene. He piled old cotton in the hallways. He describes the smell of the oil mixing with the smell of the swamp, creating a perfume of the end. He sat in his wheelchair in the hallway outside the nursery, a lit lantern in his lap, waiting for the sun to set so that the flames would be visible for miles, a beacon of his final defiance. The suspense in these final notes is palpable. Armand writes of the shadows lengthening, of the house settling for the night. He describes the humming from the nursery stopping, replaced by a silence that was louder than thunder. He knew in those final moments that he was not the executioner. He was the sacrifice. The fire was not a cleansing, it was a surrender. His last written words, jagged and stained with oil, are a recognition of his failure. "The debt is not paid," he wrote. "It is only transferred." With that, the written record of Armand Valcourt ends. The rest of the story is told by the flames and the witnesses who watched the plantation burn from the safety of the river road. The decision to burn the house was the inevitable conclusion of the Valcourt legacy. A system built on the consumption of human life could only end in self-destruction. Armand's attempt to kill Lydia was his final, futile attempt to exert control over a world that had slipped from his grasp. He lit the match, not to save himself, but to ensure that if he couldn't own the future, no one would. The Great Fire of Valcourt in November 1863 is documented not by family papers, but by the testimonies of former slaves recorded by the Works Progress Administration, WPA, in the 1930s. These elderly men and women, who were children during the war, provided vivid, consistent accounts of the night the sky turned orange over St. Francisville. Their voices, transcribed by government folklorists, provide the cinematic climax of the mystery. One witness, a woman named Sarah, who had been a scullery maid, described the fire starting in the upper floors. She recounted how the roof collapsed inward with a sound like a giant inhaling. But the fire did not behave naturally. The flames were described as cold blue at the center, moving with a deliberate intelligence, consuming the house room by room as if eating the structure. The central image of Sarah's testimony is the vision of the nursery. As the exterior walls burned away, exposing the upper rooms like a dollhouse, the witnesses saw the nursery suspended in the inferno. The floor was burning, the ceiling was falling, but standing in the center of the room, untouched by the flames, was the girl. Sarah stated, "The fire didn't touch her because she wasn't there to be burned. She was just a picture in the air. She stood there smoothing her pinafore while the master screamed." Armand Valcourt was seen on the landing, his wheelchair engulfed. The witnesses described him flailing, trying to crawl away from the heat, but being dragged back by the collapse of the floor. Lydia did not move to help him, nor did she move to hurt him. She simply watched. It was the ultimate fulfillment of the witness hypothesis. She observed his destruction with the same impassive gaze she had turned on the dying infants and the Union soldiers. When the house finally collapsed into a pile of smoldering brick and ash, the silence returned instantly. The witnesses waited until dawn, expecting to find bones. They found the charred remains of Armand Valcourt fused to the metal frame of his chair. They found the melted silver, the shattered china. But when they sifted through the ashes of the nursery, they found nothing. No small bones, no scraps of the pinafore, no trace of the girl. The interpretation of this event by the local community was immediate. The devil had come to collect his due, but he had left his change. The girl had not died. She had simply walked out of the fire because the fire had no claim on her. She was composed of something that combustion could not break down. The WPA interviewer noted that Sarah refused to speak the girl's name, referring to her only as "she who left." This event marks the physical end of the Valcourt plantation, but the beginning of the legend. The destruction of the house did not destroy the anomaly, it liberated it. Lydia was no longer bound to the nursery or the ledgers. She was loose in the world, a homeless memory of slavery wandering through the reconstruction of the South. The fire serves as the final, brutal proof of her nature. A biological child would have suffocated or burned. A ghost would have vanished. Lydia did neither. She persisted. The absence of her remains is the most terrifying evidence of all. It suggests that she walked out of the ashes, smoothed her dress, and continued her existence, unburdened by the destruction of her prison. The official history of the Valcourt family ends with the fire, but the trail of Lydia does not. In the chaotic years of reconstruction, odd data points begin to flicker in the public records of Louisiana, like a distress signal repeating in the dark. In the 1870 census for the city of New Orleans, amidst the thousands of displaced persons and orphans, There is an entry for a Lydia Foundling, age 9, living in a charity ward. The description of her scar and her silence matches the Valcour records perfectly. 15 years later, in 1885, a police report from Baton Rouge describes a mute child of mixed race, found sitting on a bench at the train station for 3 days. When officers approached her, she produced a calm, terrifying stare that caused the station dogs to howl. She was taken to an orphanage, but the records show she absconded the same night. The doors were locked from the outside. She simply ceased to be inside. The most chilling post-war document is a sealed letter written in 1903 by a schoolteacher named Clara Dubois. Clara taught at a segregated school in a rural parish near the old Valcour land. In her letter to the school board, she resigns her position, citing nerves. She confesses that for 10 consecutive years, she has had the same student in her first grade class, a girl named Lydia. Every year, the other children grew, moved on, and aged. Every year, Lydia returned, wearing the same dress, sitting at the same desk, looking exactly 9 years old. Clara wrote, "She learns nothing because she knows everything. She sits and watches the children grow old. She is waiting for something, and I cannot bear to be the one she watches." This testimony suggests that Lydia had integrated herself into the margins of society, living a cyclical existence, perhaps feeding on the vitality of new generations, or perhaps simply existing as a static monument to the past. The land where the plantation stood remained fallow for a century. Locals refused to farm it, claiming the soil was sour. In the 1920s, a developer tried to build homes there, but the project was abandoned after the foundations sank into the mud and the workers reported seeing a child standing at the edge of the tree line, watching them. The site became a dense thicket of briars and oak, reclaimed by the nature that Armand had tried to dominate. The legacy of Lydia is a legacy of unresolved trauma. She represents the history that the South tried to bury, the guilt of slavery, the violence of the plantation that refuses to stay underground. She is the ghost that doesn't haunt a house, but haunts the public record. She is the glitch in the paperwork that proves the system was monstrous. Scholars who have stumbled across these records usually dismiss them as coincidences or folklore. They rationalize the photos as hoaxes, the letters as hysteria. But the timeline holds. From 1823 to 1903, the documentation forms a coherent, impossible narrative, a single life that spans a century without consuming a single day. The investigation into the Valcour files concludes in the present day, with Daniel Foster, the researcher who first noticed the anomaly in the ledgers. After months of obsession, piecing together the fragments of this impossible life, Daniel made a discovery that shattered his professional detachment. While scanning a collection of his own family photographs for a memorial service, he found an image taken in 1994. The photo depicts a family picnic in a public park near St. Francisville, not far from the ruins of the Valcour estate. In the foreground, Daniel's family is laughing, eating, oblivious, but in the background, standing deep in the shade of the live oaks, is a figure. It is out of focus, blurry, easily dismissed as a shadow or a bystander. But digital enhancement reveals the truth. It is a dark-skinned girl. She is wearing a dress that belongs in the 1840s. She is looking directly at the camera with an expression of heavy, ancient boredom. And above her left eyebrow, faint but visible, is the scar. Lydia is not a story from the past. She is not a closed case. She is still here. She is walking through our parks, standing in the background of our lives, watching us, just as she watched the Valcour. The implication is terrifying. The debt was never paid. The sin she was created to hold has not been absolved. She is still waiting, still accumulating, a living vessel of history that we refuse to acknowledge. This story challenges us to look at the margins of our own world. What else have we ignored? What other glitches exist in our records, masking horrors that we are too afraid to name? Lydia's existence suggests that time does not heal all wounds. Some wounds become the time itself. She is the things we buried, and the things we buried do not grow old. Is history truly in the past, or is it walking among us, waiting for us to notice? Look closely at the background of your old family photos. Look at the faces of the children who don't seem to belong. You might find that you are being watched by eyes that have seen centuries. If this investigation into the impossible has unsettled you, if you believe that some truths are too strange for fiction, subscribe to Before the Story. Click the bell icon so you don't miss our next descent into the archives of the unexplained. Share this video with someone who thinks the past is dead. And tell us in the comments, do you believe Lydia was a victim, a monster, or a message we haven't learned how to read? Until next time, remember, the records never lie, but they don't always tell the whole truth.